Consequences of Industrialization. In 1839, John D. Rockefeller Sr. was born in the United States. He later founded the Standard Oil Company in 1870. The World's Fairs coincided with the power struggle for authority in physics and the monopolization of energy production, with the sinking of the Titanic and the founding of the Federal Reserve Bank. At that time, the cabal got rid of those industrialists who opposed the plan of establishing a new world order. The three most prominent opponents of the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and John Jacob Astor, all died with the sinking of the Titanic. The Titanic belonged to J.P. Morgan, one of the string pullers behind the creation of the Fed, who spontaneously decided against being present at the maiden voyage. In 1910, the first plans for the foundation of the Fed took place on Jekyll Island. In April 1912, the Titanic sank. In reality, her sister ship, the Olympic, sank. And a year later, in 1913, the Fed was founded with the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, thus laying the foundation for the arbitrary control of the world economy by the secret elite, which had already infiltrated most nations at that time. Woodrow Wilson signed the act, allowing the Fed to issue Federal Reserve notes, U.S. dollars. A few months later, the First World War began the civilizational decline in Central Europe. Nations were set against each other. In 1866, Otto von Bismarck led Prussia into the German War of Brothers against Austria. After the end of this fratricidal war, he did not include Austria in the newly formed North German Confederation and annexed Alsace-Lorraine. He thus created, possibly without being aware of it, the structural conditions for the First and Second World Wars. However, the assassination attempt on Bismarck and his dismissal by Wilhelm II indicate that he was a thorn in the side of the secret societies. His anti-Catholic policy of the Kulturkampf may also have contributed to this. The war against the Germans started with Rome's propaganda against the supposedly primitive Germania and continued with the Reformation Wars. Bismarck tried to reduce the influence of the Vatican and secret societies. The final nail in the coffin of Germany were the two world wars, followed by controlled migration and population replacement. In the course of the 30 Years' War, Germany's spiritual backbone was broken. As Heinrich Heine said, "Bondage is in the German himself, in his soul. Worse than material slavery is spiritualized slavery. Germans must be liberated from within. Nothing helps from without." Albert Einstein published his two theories of relativity in 1905 and 1916. With the general theory of relativity, the ether was finally abolished in physics. General relativity was needed primarily to explain the properties of space without recourse to an objectively existing ether field. Even Einstein was so uncomfortable with this action in retrospect, presumably he realized at some point what his financiers had intended, that he later still tried to clarify that his theories would not work at all without the ether. But by then the damage was done, and he had fulfilled his role of eliminating the old knowledge of the holistic physics of the ether from science. Holistic scientists like Nikola Tesla had no place in the New World and were starved out, but only after their skills were used.
Parents, beware. Your children homeward bound from school are being introduced to a new danger in the form of a drugged cigarette, marijuana.
It is convinced that he is hopelessly and incurably insane, a condition caused by the drug marijuana to which he was addicted.
The monopolization of production also included the demonization of hemp. Andrew Mellon, Randolph Hearst, and the DuPont family were instrumental in pushing through the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which raised taxes on hemp in the U.S. to bleed the hemp industry dry and support the oil industry. Banker Andrew Mellon appointed Harry Anslinger as chairman of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Basically, the goal was to create the conditions to make humanity dependent on the system in the long run, and to eradicate any possibility of self-determination and freedom. The 19th century was also the time of the establishment of mass indoctrination institutions, called schools, where state-imposed propaganda was taught to educate young people to become willing recipients of orders. The expansion of compulsory education and the Gleichschaltung of teachers then picked up speed again in the 20th century with the rise of fascism and communism. If the Vatican had not already achieved sufficient success through the consistent persecution of witches and the Inquisition, as well as the burning of books and the destruction of culture, then its mission was crowned with success with the widespread introduction of religious propaganda, which no child could escape. Thus, Karl-Heinz Deschner wrote in his book, God and the Fascists, the Vatican Alliance with Mussolini, Franco, Hitler, and Pavlovich, that under Mussolini, the books of the Italian elementary schools consisted of 1/3 catechism pieces and prayers, and 2/3 of glorifications of fascism and war. The whole thing was crowned only by renewed bans on anti-clerical criticism and media coverage. Thus, one of the basic principles of the old world, each community, family, lives autonomously and is responsible for its own children, was invalidated. The consequent tearing apart of these communities and the early centralized indoctrination were of central importance. Then, with the Flexner Report of 1910, the robber barons Rockefeller and Carnegie destroyed holistic medicine in the U.S. and laid the groundwork for building the anti-life medical cartel under which we live today. Electrotherapy, phytotherapy, and osteopathy, for example, were banned from the official canon, and the curriculum was standardized so that pharma-controlled conventional medicine could establish itself as the only recognized form of medicine. Most independent schools were forced to close as a result of the Flexner Report. The Flexner Report was inspired by the destruction of alternative healing methods in Germany, where the policies of the Flexner Report had already been implemented in 1880.
Throughout his life, Flexner was an ardent advocate of the German pedagogical style of medical education. He firmly believed that medicine was a scientific discipline that could best be realized in America using the German model as a prototype. It was a system in which medical scientists were trained in university hospitals. Science as the animating force in the physician's life was the overarching theme, the zeitgeist, in Flexner's conception of the ideal physician. Thomas P. Duffy, The Flexner Report, 100 years later.
Every area of modern science is now dominated by an ideological doctrinaire establishment in which positions are awarded to each other, and it is ensured that real insights are suppressed.
Aan tafel is onder andere Connie Braam. Die schreef dit schitterende boek, dat heet De Handelsreiziger. En dat gaat eigenlijk vooral over iets wat wij niet wisten, namelijk over de grootste cocaïnefabriek ter wereld. En die stond
in Amsterdam aan de Weespertrekvaart.
The British used opium to take over China. In Europe, the Royal Dutch Cocaine Factory was responsible for anesthetizing the population, and during World War I supplied all countries involved in the war with cocaine made from coca leaves imported from Peru. The origin of this factory was the Dutch East India Company. Next to the British East India Company, one of the most powerful trade and power structures of the colonial era. It was through the Dutch cocaine factory, which was supported and protected by the government and had a virtual monopoly on cocaine, that World War I was made possible, because it was only through alienation and anesthesia that soldiers were able to endure the suffering during the war. The Netherlands emerged from the First World War as one of the richest countries in the world thanks to the sale of cocaine. Innumerable traumatized soldiers remained addicted to cocaine after the war, and some even raided pharmacies to obtain it. For even more effective anesthetization of the World War II soldiers, the factory's production was shifted from cocaine to amphetamine in 1942. Michelle Gibson assumes that all the railroad tracks were just dug up and that all of the infrastructure, locomotives, cars, stations, was already in place as well. She speculates that it was an electrified rail system, and after the free worldwide energy grid was shut down, the free energy sources for mass transportation were replaced by oil and coal. The newly created dependence on fossil fuels was one of the foundations of the fabulous wealth of the industrialist robber baron families. About the tramway network in Manaus, Brazil, she writes,
"The historical narrative we are given says that rubber made Manaus the wealthiest city in South America in the late 1800s, and wealthy European families are said to have settled in Manaus, bringing their European art, architecture, and culture with them. It was a city at that time with electric trams and streetlights." Electric trams and streetlights? In the middle of the Amazon rainforest? No road connection to Manaus existed until 1973, with the completion of the BR-319, connecting Manaus to Porto-Velho, Brazil. It is 540 miles long, or 870 kilometers, going through the rainforest, and is impassable when it rains. It is known as Brazil's worst highway. There is no such tram system operating in Manaus today. The history we've been taught does not provide an adequate explanation for what was really going on here. This is a photo of undeveloped Amazon rainforest near Manaus. How are they supposed to have built all of this in the mid to late 1800s under these conditions? Michelle Gibson.
Isn't it a bit strange that directly after the sinking of the Titanic and the crash of the Hindenburg, the way of transportation was standardized worldwide so that almost exclusively petroleum is used? And this has not changed in the last 100 years. Why was the public never shown a single photo showing the beginning of the Hindenburg's fire, although 22 professional photographers were present at the event? Why was the static spark theory chosen as the cause of the Hindenburg's sinking, even though there was no evidence to support this theory? Why did all nations stop building airships after the Hindenburg burned? Between 1907 and 1909, 16 imposing American warships with other escort ships, the so-called Great White Fleet, circumnavigated the world and paid a visit to many countries, as the story goes. Officially, the purpose was to demonstrate America's power to the world and to promote cooperation. But perhaps it was simply an inspection of the newly staked possessions around the world and an inventory of which kingdoms had not yet surrendered to the new order. The foundation of the world we live in today was laid at that time during the world's exhibitions. The technological knowledge of the old world was selected. One part of the knowledge was kept secret, the other part was presented to the public. One of the most important criteria in this decision-making process may have been whether a technology could be controlled by a central authority. Any form of free, no-cost energy, for example, was very dangerous to the forces that controlled the robber barons of the industrial age secretly from the shadows. It is important to understand that these industrialists had not earned their wealth themselves. They were born into elite families and chosen to play a role. These families and structures still exist today. Be it Elon Musk, Bill Gates, or Steve Jobs, none of them rose to power and money through their own efforts. But to end with Tolkien, nothing is lost. In our world, Middle-earth, the descent into darkness dominated by evil is part of the process of humanity's evolution.
The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king.
I came into this world in the rough and ready year of 1923. It was a barbarous time. It was a bleak time, and it was an uncivilized time. My memories stretch back almost 100 years, and if I close my eyes, I can smell the poverty that oozes from the dusky tenement streets of my boyhood. I can taste on my lips the bread and drippings that I was served for my tea. I can remember extreme hunger and my parents' undying love for me.
were stacked.